Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to acknowledge the contributions made by the Black and African American communities, as well as other marginalized groups. There are sites that bear the witness to this quest for freedom. Today, we are going to be joined by the Great Heart Griot, Andre Keitt. Andre Keitt is an internationally known storyteller, and he is also a consultant to historical museums and historical societies, as well as living history museums. Today, he is going to talk to us about the perils of James Pennington. James Pennington is known throughout Connecticut as an activist and a preacher. Andre will go into his story. But before we get started, please take a look at the survey and put down any information that you would like for us to know, what topics you would like to hear, or how we can also improve the program. Thank you so very much for joining us. And now let's talk to Mr. Andre Keitt.
Good day, everyone. How's everybody doing today? I like to start off all the time asking, how are you? How are you doing? So today's talk on Pennington's perils and his pursuits has a direct relation to my family and my story and our history, and a lot of other people will feel the same way. We teach students in school to find connections in their readings and in their studies, and there was direct connection for me. For instance, my great-grandfather was Paul Greatheart, and when emancipation came, he too did not want his name, and so he took a stick to some sand and scratched some letters into the sand until he came up with the name Greatheart. And that's how I decided to pay tribute to Paul Greatheart and become the Great Heart Griot. He also rode and drove the horse and buggy that carried the boys and girls to the one-room schoolhouse. He took them to school each day, and he learned how to read and write by leaning his back up against the wall and listening through the window and listening to the lesson. So he learned how to read and write. That's how come he knew how to scratch those letters and become Greatheart. So those are two connections that you'll hear when I tell this story today about James Pennington. I want to start off with the boy in bondage. Jim Pembroke's story is one of the great slave narratives of American history. After his escape, Pembroke changed his name to James William Charles Pennington, and against all odds became one of the most distinguished and respected of all African American leaders of the 19th century. We know about his early life as a slave primarily from his autobiography published in 1849 as The Fugitive Blacksmith, or Events in the History of James W.C. Pennington. Pennington was born circa 1807, and no one is certain of the date, but in Queens Anne County on the eastern shore of Maryland, he surely was born. His mother, Nellie Pembroke, and therefore Pennington, were slaves to James Tillman, a judge on Maryland's Court of Appeals and the state's first attorney general. Pennington's father, Basil, was owned by a different slaveholder on a nearby plantation, and when James Tillman died in 1809, his will was administered by his eldest surviving son, Frisbee Tillman, a character indeed. Frisbee, several years earlier, had immigrated from Queen Anne's County to Washington County in mid-Maryland, a wheat-growing region that was one of the most rapidly expanding sections of the state. And after settling his father's affairs, Frisbee Tillman returned to his Washington County estate, Rockland, with Nellie, his wife, and two sons, Robert and Jim. Pennington's father was thus separated from his family by over 200 miles. But Tillman soon thereafter purchased Basil and brought him also to Rockland. For Pennington did not know it at the time, of course, but he had been inherited by one of Washington County's leading citizens, Frisbee Tillman had once studied to be a doctor. But after marrying into a prominent local family, the Rangols, he became a wheat farmer and an active participant in the civic life of his adopted region. He represented Washington County 4 times in Maryland's House of Delegates, served as a justice in the county's Orphans Court, formed and commanded a local militia company, helped to found the first agricultural society in the county, as well as an academy in Hagerstown, championed the building of Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and other internal improvements in the region, served on the board of directors and local banks, and was influential as one of the more progressive farmers in the region. Frisbee was quite important. Pennington recalled in his memoirs that Tillman normally had a kind disposition, but was a strict disciplinarian with his slaves and was ever vigilant to extinguish any sign of autonomy from them. Tillman, for example, was an instigator of several laws in the country concerning the control of slaves, including one which prohibited slaves from going over a certain number of miles from their plantations on Sundays, when they were traditionally allowed to visit family members in nearby plantations. He also once had authorities disband a local Sunday school for free blacks, which had been established by Methodist and Lutheran churches, lest, according to Pennington, the slaves should get some benefit of it. Tillman's treatment of Pennington and his family, as we shall see, sparked Pennington's later determination to flee being enslaved. As a young boy, Pennington helped his parents as much as he could around the plantation until at around age 8 or 9. And he and his older brother Robert were hired out by Tillman to learn trades. As in many other slave areas, there was a certain custom in the region for slave owners to apprentice a few of their young slaves to tradesmen in order for the slaves to learn a skill that could later be used on the plantation. Pennington was placed with a stonesman in Hagerstown, 6 miles from Tillman's plantation. Pennington's brother Robert was apprenticed to a different tradesman in that very same town. And since neither Pennington's nor his brother's employers were slave owners themselves, the 2 boys enjoyed, for a brief time, relative freedom. Pennington stayed with the stonesmason for about 3 years, and then he returned home. His new skills were immediately employed helping to erect a new blacksmith shop for the plantation. Tillman's blacksmith was a slave who had learned his trade just as Pennington had learned stonemasonry. And Pennington was placed in the new shop to learn that craft too. He worked as a blacksmith on Tillman's plantation for 9 years and took great pride in his work. He wrote in his autobiography that his craftsman's pride was one of the things that reconciled him so long to being a slave. I sought to distinguish myself in the finer branches of the business by invention and finish. I frequently tried my hand at making guns and pistols, putting blades in penknives, making fancy hammers, hatchets, swords, and canes, etc. Pennington recalled in his book many details of how slaves in Washington County lived. It touched upon foodways, religion, and clothing, for example, but he was understandably more interested in describing for readers the cruelties of slavery. Remember that Pennington wrote his autobiography in 1849 when slavery was still legal. In the preface of his book, he particularly criticized people who spoke of mild forms of slavery. My feeling, he says, are always outraged when I hear them speak of kind masters, Christian masters, the mildest form of slavery. Well-fed and clothed slaves as extenuations of slavery. I am satisfied that they either mean to pervert the truth or they do not know what they say. The being of slavery, its soul and body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, the cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences to a greater or less extent. So he didn't think anything about mild slavery, as you see. Pennington cited many examples throughout his book to illustrate the cruelty and barbarity of slavery, even of the so-called mild kind. He witnessed slave children sold from the plantation to the deep South, men and women flogged, a slave struck with a pitchfork by an overseer, and slaves shot. One slave tried to run from one of the Frisbee Tillman's overseers who was about to beat him with a club. The overseer grabbed a gun and shot the slave, hitting him in the legs. The slave managed to hide in the nearby woods, but the pain forced him to surrender that very night. Tillman did not immediately tend to his wounds, but had him locked up that night, and in the morning had the overseer tie him down and flog him. Only then did Tillman pick the shot out of the slave's leg. In another example, one of Tillman's sons coveted a young slave woman on the plantation, and as a result, to save the honor of the son, Tillman sold the slave to a buyer from Georgia, even though her parents pleaded with him to allow them to arrange a local sale. Pennington and his family did not escape the wrath of Tillman and his overseers either. And one particular incident produced a turning point in Pennington's conception of himself and his entire enslaved situation. Tillman allowed his slaves who had families on other nearby plantations to leave on Saturday night to go to their families, but they had to be back by early Monday morning. 3 of his field hands were not back one particular Monday morning, and Tillman was very angry, to say the least. Pennington's father was tending a lamb that morning on the plantation, and Tillman vented his anger at his father, Basil. And when Basil replied in a way that Tillman felt was insolent, he took out a cowhide whip and, in Pennington's words, fell upon him with most savage cruelty and inflicted 15 or 20 severe stripes with all of his strength over his shoulders in the small of his back. As he raised himself upon his toes and gave the last stripe, he said, "By the explicative, I will make you know that I am master of your tongue as well as your time." Pennington was near enough that he wrote he could hear and he could see, even count the savage stripes inflicted upon his father. And Pennington recalled that this incident created an open rupture within his family, as each member felt the deep insult that had been inflicted upon our head. The spirit of the whole family was roused. We talked of it in our nightly gatherings and showed it in our daily melancholy aspect. And did this cause Tillman to regret his actions? On the contrary. The oppressor saw this, and with the heartlessness that was in perfect keeping with the first insult, commenced a series of tauntings, threatenings, and insinuations with a view to crush the spirit of the entire family. Pennington's response was a portent of his latter actions. Although it was some time after this event before I took the decisive step, yet in my mind and spirit, I never was a slave after it. He particularly never forgot the symbolism and the stark contrast between the gentleness of his father's caring for the lamb and the cruelty of Tillman. Pennington now despised Tillman, and the slave owner, knowing this, sought incidents which he could punish the young man. Soon afterward, Pennington made his decision to emancipate himself by running away. On the afternoon of October 28, 1827, he left Rockland as if to visit his brother in Hagerstown. But once there, as night was falling, he kept walking, thinking only of freedom. Sunday, October 28, 1827, was Jim Pembroke's last day in Washington County, Maryland. A slave for all of his 21 years, Pembroke had decided the previous day to escape. Yet, as he sat alone that Sunday morning, awaiting the right moment to leave, he hesitated and considered the difficulties of his decision. First and foremost, he was worried about his family. He would be leaving behind on the plantation not only his mother and his father, but also 10 siblings, plus a beloved older brother nearby. What would become of them? Pembroke was well aware that it was a custom for families of runaways to be sold to the Deep South before they had a chance to follow their kinsmen. What, on the other hand, would happen to him if he failed? The consequences would be, no doubt, severe. Even if he managed to escape, he was unsure how to even get to Pennsylvania and to freedom. He would only guess at the distance from his plantation to the state border. And he had little sense of direction, save for following the North Star, which a lot of folk did. Years later, Pembroke wrote of his mental anguish that day. How the impression came to be upon my mind, I cannot tell, but there was a strange and horrifying belief that if I did not meet the crisis that day, I should be self-doomed, that my ear would be nailed to the doorpost forever. The emotions of that moment I cannot fully depict. Hope, fear, dread, terror, sorrow, and deep melancholy were mingled in my mind together. My mental state was one of the most painful distraction. But the hour was now come, and the man must act and be free, or remain a slave forever. Pembroke put a piece of bread in his pocket, looked around his slave quarters one last time, and left behind Washington County and slavery forever. I felt like a mariner who has gotten his ship outside of the harbor and has spread his sails to the breeze. The cargo is on board, the ship is cleared, and the voyage I must make. Besides, this being my first night, almost everything will depend upon my clearing the coast before the day dawns. In order to do this, my flight must be rapid. I therefore set forth in sorrowful earnest. Only now and then I was cheered by the wild hope that I should somewhere at some time be free. Freedom's flight and folly. His escape was not that easy. He retells in his narrative how at one point he was penned up in a barn and he hid behind hay, livestock, and kept looking outside during the day, making sure that he would only leave to travel at night, and how it seemed that there was a young boy at the house who kept coming out and looking towards the barn as if he knew that he was there. and how he would slip away one haystack at a time, one shrub at a time, one bush at a time, and slither, and made sure he traveled near the road, but only at night. And after doing that for several days, it was 6 days after he fled when he arrived at the door of William and Phoebe Wright, a local Quaker from family known for harboring escaped slaves. He didn't know that. They lived near York Springs and sheltered him for 6 months. It was while he stayed with the Wrights he discovered his utter ignorance, always lamenting what slavery had deprived him. There is one sin that slavery committed against me which I never can forgive. It robbed me of my education. The injury is irreparable. I feel the embarrassment more seriously now than I ever did before. It cost me 2 years hard labor after I fled to unshackle my mind. It was 3 years before I had purged my language of slavery's idioms. It was 4 years before I had thrown off the crouching aspect of slavery. Finally, there was a haven in Hartford, Connecticut. And one historian has written that Pennington was one of the most distinguished of all fugitives from bondage. And another referred to him as one of the most educated and literate Black men of his time. It was with this persistence, this thirst for knowledge and achievement that skyrocketed Pennington into becoming an international sensation. One could almost feel his sense of urgency with his words. When I consider how much now, more than ever, depends upon sound and thorough education among colored men, I am grievously overwhelmed with a sense of my deficiency, and more especially as I can ever hope now to make it up. He didn't think he could make it up. If I know my own heart, I have no ambition but to serve the cause of suffering humanity. All that I have desired or sought has been to make me more efficient for good. So far, I have some consciousness that I've done my utmost, and should my further days be few or many, I am reconciled to meet the last account, hoping to be acquitted of any willful negligence of duty. But I shall have to go to my last account with this charge against the system of slavery. Vile monsters, thou hast hindered my usefulness by robbing me of my early education. Oh, what I might have been now, but for this robbery perpetrated upon me as soon as I saw the light. He grieved being a slave and just not knowing. He grieved his ignorance. And he leveled accusation against the system of slavery. And he didn't feel that he could forgive that. Even when he went to school and studied at Yale University in New Haven, some people say that he audited the classes. And I'm going to go by his very words, where he said he was outside in the hallway and he learned and got his degree. Well, after Reverend James Pennington jettisoned through his education, learning Greek and Latin, teaching and preaching in New York, where he began to champion the rights of Negroes as an abolitionist, he suffered the challenges of studying divinity at Yale University, here in New Haven, Connecticut. Armed with his credentials as a newly ordained minister, he arrived here in Hartford, Connecticut in 1840, where he transformed himself into a charismatic personality. He's remembered as an eloquent orator, preacher, and freedom fighter that was catapulted into celebrity as the pastor of the Talcott Street Church. He didn't confine his ambition strictly to the church. His brand of abolitionism was distinctly evangelical and closely tied to other moral reform movements. Among his accomplishments, Pennington turned Fifth Congregation, or Talcott Street Church, into a depot of the Underground Railroad. To usher in runaway slaves to freedom, also raising money for anti-slavery causes. And in 1840, Pennington and other African Americans met in Hartford to plan a nationwide convention exclusively for Black abolitionists to plan for the future. Such a meeting was necessary. Pennington said, due to the division among our friends. Everybody didn't believe in the same approach. There were radicals and gradualists. The gradualists wanted to bide their time and work with a system that was put in place that wasn't even there to help them. And the radicals wanted to take what was theirs. Wonder what side, can you guess, that James Pennington was on? One of his more notable sermons took place on Thanksgiving Day in 1841 at Fifth Congregational Church. Again, it was later named Talcott Street Church, and now it's Faith Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut. It was one of the first of many of his writings to be published that same year. A textbook of the origins and history of colored people was also published. It was the first history book of a Black man. It was primarily intended for school children, primarily at his church's school, where he also taught. But it was also held up as a treatise on the prehistorical and historical evolution of race and Blackness. The textbook glorifies Blacks' African heritage and denounces racial stereotypes that are still being denounced today, by the way. Further, this book asserted the African origin of ancient Kemetic civilization and the Kushite origin in the United States. Reverend Pennington dared to argue against European claims to superiority and establish the African origins of Western European civilization. One of the most amazing things about this book is that it not only covers the African American experience in the United States, but it also covers the experience of Blacks around the world. A Renaissance man, he contributed to 2 anti-slavery newspapers, the Colored American, and when that folded, he edited another newspaper, the Clarksonian. This paper was primarily used for him to keep in touch with fellow abolitionists as he traveled the world. Reverend Pennington was twice elected president of the Hartford Central Association of Congregational Ministers, a body that was composed exclusively of Europeans. So this was a major feat. His Amistad activism or activities included, Pennington saw that the Amistad case, it was a prime opportunity to further not only to push the cause of abolitionists, but of Christian evangelism as well. Although he must have followed the Amistad story closely from the first, Pennington's name does not appear in the public record in connection with the case until May 1841. And we know that the Amistad Mende went back to Sierra Leone in March. All this happened way after the U.S. Supreme Court had freed these Africans. And when he was called on by the African Americans to organize support for the African missions, he did so. And subsequently, 43 delegates from 5 states convened in Hartford in August, a meeting over which Pennington presided with 5 of the Amistad Mende. They were also in attendance. Here in Hartford, and the Union Missionary Society was formed, and Pennington took the helm as its first president. Working through the UMS, Pennington raised funds to pay for the Africans' return voyage and meanwhile recruited African American missionaries to accompany them. So he had a really crucial part in that, but you don't find that out. You have to do some really deep digging to see that Pennington had a lot to do with the Amistad affair. And well after the gentlemen bore the Africans and missionaries away to Sierra Leone, Pennington remained closely engaged. And in 1846, the UMS was subsumed by the larger and largely white-controlled American Missionary Association. And Pennington's role, you shouldn't be surprised, receded a bit. Though he served on the AMA's executive board until 1841, he continued to speak on behalf of its missions and its programs. His work as head of the UMW launched him into national and international prominence and led to his nomination to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1843. He represented Connecticut, and while his wife Harriet died in 1846, his trips abroad became more and more frequent. This led Reverend Pennington to eventually resign his post as minister of Fifth Congregational Church, also known as Talcott Street Church of Hartford, also known as what is Faith Congregational Church. He resigned in 1847. But while he was pastor at the church, he continued to preach against the ill treatment of Blacks in Northern America, especially in Hartford. And I put a pin there because, first of all, a lot of people didn't even understand that slavery took place in the North, in Connecticut, in Hartford. But Hartford was a bastion of slavery, and many civil rights and many historic figures of African American descent came through Hartford, and some were treated okay, and a lot of them weren't treated well. Frederick Douglass wasn't treated that well, but he did find where he could be embraced, and so did Pennington. And I mentioned Frederick Douglass because Pennington actually performed the wedding nuptials for Frederick Douglass when he got married to his first wife. Although the people of Connecticut detested the institution of slavery, they were by no means ready to accept Blacks as social equals or to allow them even the right to vote. Because remember, just because you were an abolitionist does not mean, or did not mean, that you were for equal rights for Black men, women, or white women either. Most free Blacks were content just to be free. James Pennington was not. This man of common size, who was slightly inclined to corpulency, with an athletic frame and a good constitution, challenged not just the Southern system of slavery, but Connecticut's refusal to accord Blacks their civil rights. Freedom, finally. In Reverend Pennington's best-selling book, The Fugitive Blacksmith, published in 1849, he'd been called one of the 10 most important slaves, that had been called one of the 10 most slave narratives, had been noted by literary historians, and provided Mark Twain with a wealth of wonderful ideas. The Fugitive Blacksmith went through 3 editions in 11 months, selling 6,000 copies, a great accomplishment in the 19th century. At that time, Pennington was still a fugitive, a secret that was revealed to the world upon publication of the book. Though his friends had attempted to purchase his freedom along with his parents earlier in the 1840s from Frisbee Tillman, negotiations failed because Tillman was greedy. Let's face it, Pennington became quite famous, and Frisbee Tillman wanted to be paid handsomely for it. And he was also very angry that a good one got away. In 1847, the same year Pennington left Talcott Street Congregational Church, Frisbee Tillman died. The administrator of his estate let it be known that $150 would buy Pennington's freedom. After some negotiations with Hartford's John Hooker, Pennington was technically a free man for the first time in his life by June of 1851. However, prior to Tillman's death, Reverend Pennington wrote a remarkable letter to his former owner. And in this letter from 1844, Pennington turned the slave-master relationship on his head. Basically, he had learned to speak the king's English, and he most eloquently told the man off. Pennington had emancipated himself years before that when he saw his father being beaten. He was emancipated in his own head. And that letter that he wrote to his former enslaver, it emancipated him again. Slavery is not an easy topic to study, yet it is significant as a part of our nation's tragic history. By studying people like Reverend J.W.C. Pennington, we will start to fill that giant artwork that is our complex past and begin to work on understanding of who we are, where we come from, and where we can go as a people. Thank you. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Thank you for that. That's a minor detail that is necessary. So thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so very much for that. And we have some questions that have been posted for us.
I hope I know the answers.
I'm sure you will. Denise, she wants to know, why is it she was never taught this in history class? Why did they never learn about James Pennington in history class?
Do you have a last name for Denise?
I do not.
Okay. I think I know that person. That's why. Why wasn't she taught this in class, in history class? The same reason why we're having problems with critical race theory debunk and debacle right now. It's not a history that was valued. It's not a history that was looked at as worth anything, and it wasn't looked at as American history. Now it is. It always has been American history, but now we've got folks who are pulling it out.
Exactly. And I like to tell people, when it comes to CRT, or critical race theory, first I like to ask the question, what is it? And most people don't know what it is. They just realize it's a buzzword that creates fear. So I like to tell people it's actual inclusive history of everyone's story that's a part of the making of this country. We have a question from Valerie. She says, what can the community do to properly commemorate James Pennington today in Hartford?
So, I'm going to look at a Kwanzaa principle of Kaumba, being creative. And that's one thing that our people, and many people, are quite creative, but we have a particular reverence for Reverend Dr. Pennington. And I think there are many creative ways that we can revere him today. We can, during Kwanzaa, during Juneteenth, during Black History, which is 365 days of the year, not just Black History Month. Any opportunity that we get a chance to, if you are a person who works for a library, or you work for a insurance company, find opportunities by creating events that will get your personnel to celebrate and study who James Pennington was. The Black churches can do different kinds of workshops and celebrations, and I always call them jubilations. They can do all kinds of programmings. When you hear about James Pennington, go to those events. There's books that are out. There's a brand new book that came out a couple of months ago on James Pennington. I always tell people, anything that you want to revere, study, and celebrate, read as much as you can read about that particular individual or that happening, and go out there to any of the events that are happening. And if you don't know about any events that are happening, create one. Be the change you want to be or you want to see.
Awesome. Before we go to the next questions, just want to remind everyone to please go to the survey and let us know what topics you would like to hear in the future, and if you would like for us to do anything differently. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Our next question comes from Mariana. She would like to know, did Pennington ever meet the Amistad Africans in person?
Okay, so yes, he did. And I don't want to chastise Mariana because she's a nice lady, but I said that in my talk.
All right.
He did get a chance to meet them, and he did do a lot of work on their behest.
Awesome. And then we have a question from Carrie. Please describe how Mr. Pennington was successful at organizing and paying for his education, continued education.
So, organizing his education, he just went and applied, and he wasn't welcome and embraced with open arms, but he persisted until he was accepted as a student. Sometimes like I mentioned in my talk a few minutes ago, when he went to Yale, he had to stand out in the hall, but he persisted. He stood out in the hall, just like my great grandfather Paul Greatheart. He laid up against the wall and he listened. And that's something that I think we need to tell these stories. For the folks who said, how can we honor him? Tell these stories, because these stories are going to perpetuate more education and more learning for students that are in classrooms that aren't learning what they think they need to learn, and we think they need to learn. They're sitting right there in the classroom, and you have Pennington out in the hallway learning how to do what he needed to do, get his education when he was at Yale. And how did he finance it? He was a carriage boy. So he rode the buggy like my great grandfather. He drove a buggy, and he made money. So he was able to, and I understand he was like an errand person. At that time, they would have called him an errand boy, but I try to move away from that.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, another question is, did the Penningtons have children at all? Do we know anything about the descendants of Mr. Pennington?
Okay, I think I can't. Let me see. That's a good one. I believe they had children. I can't tell you how many kids or, what gender they were or anything like that. That's something I still have some study to do.
It's okay. That's all right. Now, were he and Frederick Douglass close friends? Did they really associate outside of just doing his marriage? Were they really good friends?
They became friends, and they became friends shortly thereafter, because they both were, they found commonalities and things that, were similar with one another, though they were 10 years apart in age, with Pennington being older. They became friends because they had a lot in common.
Okay, awesome. Now, with Mr. Pennington, do we know exactly where he lived when he was here in Hartford?
Oh, we do. I just can't remember right now. He did live in the section that was most noted for where African Americans lived at the time. I can't remember right now off the top of my head exactly where. It's only so much is going to fit in this cranium here.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right. So, Great Heart, we do appreciate you stopping by. Where can people get in touch with you if they wanted to hear some of your Mama Thompson stories, or to have you as a consultant for their institution? Where can people reach out to you?
Excuse me. So I have a Facebook page, and my Facebook page is Andre Keitt, Great Heart Griot's on there. Just look up my name on, as you see it printed here on the screen. I think my name is first, and then Great Heart Griot is after that. But I am on Facebook, and you can reach me there. And they can contact me through Connecticut Freedom Trail too, from what I understand. So yeah.
Yes, you are one of our artists that if any on the Freedom Trail wanted to have you come and speak, they can reach out to us. We do have artist roster for Black and African American speakers for those who are on the Freedom Trail. Now, Mr. Griot, Great Heart Griot, can you please tell us how did you actually get started along the lines of being able to do these particular stories?
Like the one I did today.
That one, as well as some of the stories that you tell.
Okay, so my grandmother, Martha Great Heart Thompson, affectionately known as Baby. We didn't call her Baby. We couldn't call her Baby. Her contemporaries called her Baby, but Mama Thompson is what we called her. She's the baby of 12 siblings. And her father was Paul Greatheart, for whom I've already given tribute. She used to tell me stories. And she told my sister and my brother the same stories. And my sister and my brother would get sick and tired of her telling the same story over and over. And I just that's why I knew I liked history, because to me, it's just a conglomeration of stories. So she would tell the stories over and over, and I would listen to it because it seemed to me just like when you see a movie or read a book or see a rerun on television of a show, that I would have missed something that first, second, and third time. So I would always glean more from the story. So as she told me stories, I just would eventually I had to write them down because she would not let me record her. So yeah, she started me telling stories, and I actually tell a lot of the stories that she told me.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Which is of your favorite of those stories that you've gotten from your grandmother?
The favorite story that I have is one that Mama Thompson told me that when she had gotten to be a senior citizen in Orangeburg, South Carolina, she was walking in downtown Orangeburg, South Carolina, and these two white men were following her and heckling her and pestering her. And she reached down in her purse and pulled out her gun and pointed it to them. And she says, "I'll shoot the shit out you." And I just love that story so much. I know that, in the days of anti-NRA and gun violence and all that might not have been the most politically correct story to tell. But you asked me what my favorite story was. And I just like the story of the fact that she has always been feisty, and she did not fall victim to being taunted by some racist thugs.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that story. It actually takes you back to a time where it was for protection because it was out and outright violence against a person because of the color of their skin or the gender of their being. So I definitely understand that. Before we part, sir, are there any words that you would like to leave the audience in regards to history, Mr. Pennington, or anything?
Wow. You should have told me that earlier. I would have had something ready.
Well, see, here's the thing. It's kind of hard to interview someone because, you're familiar, you know everything. So what would you like to leave us? Just a little tidbit.
Okay, so I feel like it's important that keepers of stories, tale keepers, librarians, storytellers, historians, actors, I think it's important that we continue to do that good work, and that we should continue to find new platforms where we find young people to pass the baton. Because I think that sooner or later we're going to get it as a human race, that if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. And if you don't learn from your history, you're bound to repeat it. So I just think it's really important that, we continue to teach the young. And I say it the way I say it because there are some people, some kids, some young people, some young parents who don't want to hear it.
Mhm.
Oh, I've heard about slavery over and over. There's got to be some news stories. Well, I'm not saying that we need to always tell the stories about the drudgery of slavery, but we definitely need to talk about how people were triumphant through it and how they made it through, because those are keys to the keepers.
Mhm.
And those keepers need to pass those stories on so that, I mean, they're survival techniques.
Mhm. Yeah.
If I had to leave anything, that's what I would leave.
I like that. I agree. We have to be able to pass the baton to the next generation because it's not about us. It's about the stories. It's about the resilience. It's about the determination. It's about the ingenuity of those who were in a situation that they had no control over, but yet they managed to prosper. So I like the fact that we're telling the stories, not just the drudgery of slavery, because that was just a condition they were in, but I like the fact that we're continuing to tell or even bring up those positive aspects of those times of being in a situation that you have no control over, but yet and still you were able to prosper, because those are the things that we eventually inherited from those who were in those situations. And that's how we get through the system of oppression even to this day. So I agree that we need to keep those stories going, but we also need to make sure how we're telling those stories. In the past, the stories were told from one lens, but today these stories are being told from all lenses. So everyone's story is included, everyone's story is told, and I think that is how it's starting to take a turn, where the younger generation are getting more interested because they're getting to see themselves in these stories. So, Great Heart Griot, I thank you so very much for joining us today at Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. It was a pleasure. And thank all of you for joining us. We appreciate you. Our audience is growing and we appreciate that. So please tell a friend. Make sure you come back. Next Conversation at Noon will be in July rather. And it is talking about the importance of Venture Smith, where we will have, here it says May 24th, but it is actually the last Tuesday in July. And it will be at the same time. We will have our conversation with Elizabeth Wood, Executive Director of the Stonington Historical Society. We will have Elizabeth Norman, who is the publisher of the Connecticut Explored magazine, and Carl Stofko, who is the founder of Venture Smith Day. And that happens in September. So please join us next month on the fourth Tuesday of the month for our next conversation at noon. And please do not forget to fill out the survey. And again, we really appreciate you for joining us today. And we hope to see you again. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Next time.